22. Now in chapter 22, now remember, Paul had come back, ending his third missionary journey. He was traveling with a group, a collection of his disciples from the various communities he had founded in the Mediterranean. Some representatives of each of those communities, because he was bringing with him back to Jerusalem the collection that he speaks a lot about in his epistles, specifically, like Second Corinthians. You can see a lot about it, but Luke doesn't mention it for some odd reason. But for Paul, according to his letters, it was important. So anyway, he's coming back with this group of representatives from his Christian churches to Jerusalem. And originally, he intended to be there for the Passover, but he's delayed. He makes it in time for Pentecost. And so he lands at Caesarea finally, and he and his group go down to Jerusalem. They meet with the elders, the leaders of the church in Jerusalem, including James. The leaders in the church in Jerusalem are concerned because there's this perception or misperception that Paul is against the law, that he's preaching a gospel that's anti-law, meaning referring to the Torah, the Mosaic law. And so precisely to dispel this, they come up with a plan that says, look, Paul is going to go with these, there's a few men who want to take this Nazirite vow we talked about, meaning this period where they vow a certain purity. And Paul also undergo a smaller period of purification of about 7 days after returning from the Gentile lands. And so they say, Paul, why don't you go with these men who are going to take the Nazirite vow, start your own period of purification in the temple by publicly sponsoring these men who are taking the Nazirite vow, and thereby showing yourself to be still someone who follows the law and respects the temple. And because there's always these dual charges against Jesus, against Stephen, against the Christians in general. The dual charges are that they're against the temple and that they're against the law, the two most important things to the Jews. So Paul agrees to do this precisely because he is not preaching a law-free gospel, which, the Protestants, even reading some commentaries today on this section we're about to read, just keep hammering that Paul is preaching this law-free gospel, even though the evidence does not suggest that at all. He's preaching a kind of law-free gospel only for the Gentiles. Even then, they still have to abide by the law, in the sense that what the decision was in Acts 15 was that the Gentiles would have to abide by the law in considering them not as full Jews, but as sojourners or alien residents within the people of Israel. So they're still following the law for those people. They're not being considered Jews, full Jews in the same sense, but they are considered people dwelling among the Israelites, not full Jews, and therefore abiding by the law, what the law says for those people. So this idea that Paul has this anti-law or law-free gospel is just baloney. It's a kind of Protestant construction that's being read back onto Paul. So anyway, so it's in this context that Paul previously in our last session goes into the temple with these men taking the Nazirite vow, and it's there that the plan seems to backfire in a sense, because there are some for these festal days of Passover and Pentecost, there are other diaspora Jews present in Jerusalem, as one would expect, including some from Asia who recognize Paul and have this antipathy toward him and are perpetuating this kind of misperception of him. So they start this big hubbub, this tumult in the temple precincts, saying and accusing him, since they had seen him traveling with Trophimus, a Gentile from Ephesus, saying that they had brought a Gentile into the temple proper, which would have been a death sentence. Now, there's no evidence Paul did this. They just assumed he did it because they saw him traveling with this man in town, and then they saw Paul in the temple. So a big hubbub develops, and a mob kind of pushes Paul out of the temple area into the temple precincts. And the Roman soldiers who are in the fortress, which is positioned on the northeast corner of the temple precincts, they see what's going on. This was kind of why they were there. There was also a tower on the southwest corner where they could observe the whole area, and they quickly respond. They come down and they seize Paul, which seems odd. He's the one being attacked according to our view, but for them, it was easier just to remove the problem. Everyone was beating this guy up, so they take him into what we would maybe call protective custody, and they start trying to get him out of the area and take him back into the fortress up on the northeast corner of the temple precincts. And as they're going up the steps into this fortress, Paul asks leave from the commander. Let me say a few words. And the commander probably is thinking to himself, maybe he can say something that's going to dispel whatever misconception is going on here that's causing the riot. And what do I have to lose at this point? It couldn't get any worse. So the commander says, okay, go ahead. So Paul begins this speech in which he's presenting himself as a true Jew. And this is where we left off last time. So he's talking about here in verse 20, we're in chapter 22, verse 20 here. And he's describing his role in actually persecuting Stephen and leading to Stephen's death. So he's saying, not only am I a pious Jew, I was the lead persecutor of these Christians. All right, then 21. Then this, and so everyone's listening up to, the crowd quiets down. The Jews who had been trying to rip him to pieces are quieting down, listening to what he has to say, because they can't get to him anymore. He's up the stairs and flanked by these Roman guards, soldiers. And so they're actually listening to what he has to say. And then he comes to this line in 21 where we ended last time. Then he, meaning he's talking about Christ, who he describes his conversion experience on the road to Damascus. And he says, then he, meaning Jesus, said to me, depart, for I will send you far from here to the Gentiles. And this is when their patience is done, right? So in other words, he's saying that he's been directed by God. And he was saying that he had this he was having this revelation in the temple also, which would fit with Isaiah, for example, his initiation experience. He has this vision of God in Isaiah chapter 6 while he's in the temple. There's other instances in the Old Testament, and Paul's saying that he also had this vision recently in the temple of Jesus saying these things to him. And so that's where their patience ends. They're saying, because he's saying to them, I was in the Jerusalem temple. I'm a pious Jew. I was in the Jerusalem temple recently. And this Jesus said to me, I'm sending you now to the Gentiles to speak to them. And this is kind of like a slap in the face. They don't care about the Gentiles. What are you talking about, the Gentiles? We're the people of God. All right. So here we're in verse 22. And they listened to him until this word. And then they raised their voices and said, away with such a fellow from the earth, for he is not fit to live. It's kind of an awkward translation there, a little bit literal, but get this guy out of here. Do away with him, take him away. It's almost echoing the shouts of the crowd to Pilate, crucify him, crucify him. 23. Then as they cried out and tore off their clothes and threw dust into the air, which were signs of kind of mourning, or remember that the high priest did this. He tore his clothes when he claimed that Jesus blasphemed before him. So this was an indication of, this man is blaspheming.
Father,
yeah.
Father, where would they get dust? They're standing out in the temple, right? They're in the temple court.
They're in the temple court. Yeah, it would have been covered with... you have people tracking through there all day long. You would have had, it would have had probably a stones laid down, but it'd still be dust. It's a very kind of desert environment. So there would some kind of dirt or dust that's at their feet, and it's a symbolic action. So it's you don't need a huge amount. It's a symbolic action, meaning to show this kind of mourning for or disdain for something that's improper that just happened. So they did this in 24. The commander ordered him to be brought into the barracks. So they're standing at the steps, the threshold of the barracks. He let him have this speech thinking, well, what do I have to lose? This mob already wants to kill him anyway. So he lets Paul speak. Now Paul's speaking in Aramaic, right? He's speaking in Aramaic, which the commander would not have understood. The commander was impressed that Paul spoke Greek. So he allows Paul to speak in Aramaic. He has no idea what they're saying to each other, but he can see that, okay, he's speaking, they're quieting down, they're listening, and then all of a sudden they start ripping their clothes and throwing dirt in there, and he says, okay, I don't know what he said, but this isn't going well. So he says, all right, get him out of here. He yanks him into the fortress and said that he should be examined under scourging so that he, the commander, might know why they shouted so against him, because he didn't understand the Aramaic. So, and this was what's typical of the Romans. If for a slave or anyone that they didn't consider important, which is pretty much everyone except Romans, they would torture in order to get the information they needed. So, and they're talking about scourging here, which, if you've ever seen Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ, there's a very violent scene where they show Jesus being scourged, as it says in the gospel. So it was this instrument of kind of like a cat of nine tails, a whip with many cords. And at the end of the cords were tied, pieces of sharp bone or metal, or, it was a horrific instrument. And so, that kind of torture, people will tell you anything. So he says, all right, go take him to be scourged just so I can figure out what's going on here. 25. And as they bound him with thongs, in other words, they start tying him up with strips of leather, Paul said to the centurion who stood by, is it lawful for you to scourge a man who is a Roman and uncondemned? So he says, he claims for the first time his Roman citizenship. And he says, which they would have had no idea about. They probably would be the furthest thing from their mind that this man was a Roman citizen, because it was rare for Jews, especially there in Judea, to be Roman citizens. So he's claiming Roman citizenship, which according to Roman law, and we're going to see here, the Romans take their law very seriously. They follow the law, generally speaking. According to Roman law, if someone claimed citizenship, you had to treat them as a Roman citizen until it could be proven or disproven. So it wasn't like today necessarily, where people have passports and everything's electronic. It might take a little bit longer to ascertain whether they're truly a citizen or not. But as soon as he claims that, the game changes. And furthermore, he says, I'm a Roman and uncondemned, meaning you can't just beat me without a trial. And because in Roman law, as well as in Jewish law, there was a presumption of innocence. And so what they're doing is very bad form. It's illegal. 26. When the centurion heard that, he's uh-oh. This is serious. This man is saying he's a Roman citizen, and even if it doesn't appear to me like he's a Roman citizen, Paul's just told him that in Greek, which the commander previously remarked how good his Greek was. And so all of a sudden the centurion is probably like, okay, this could be a problem. So he went and told the commander, saying, take care what you do, for this man is a Roman. 27. Then the commander came. So the commander is also, he drops whatever he's doing, comes straight away. He had just said, all right, you guys go beat him and, find out what you can and come give me a summary. Now, all of a sudden, when they say he's a Roman, he drops whatever he's doing. He goes immediately and takes care of it himself. Then the commander came and said to him, Paul, tell me, are you a Roman? Paul said, yes. 28. The commander answered, with a large sum I obtained this citizenship. So what does he, and Paul said, but I was born a citizen. So what's he mean here? So this commander's name is Lysias Claudius. Lysias Claudius. And so it seems that what happened was he bought his Roman citizenship. So he was someone who worked his way up from the bottom, and especially during the reign of the Emperor Claudius, which I don't know if anyone ever studied Latin and you saw the old TV show I Claudius. Anybody ever see that? It was in Latin class, we would watch that. Anyway, it was an old TV show showing kind of representing the life and times of Claudius the emperor, who reigned kind of accidentally in the 40s and 50s in Rome. And during Claudius's time, it's well known, it's well established that they accepted payment for citizenship. It was a way to enrich the family, and it was a way for Claudius's kind of his wife in particular, and some of his other high court officials themselves would accept bribes in order to push through a citizenship application. And so this man apparently is saying that he paid a large sum of money to get citizenship, and that's probably where he gets the last name Claudius, Lysias Claudius, because they would typically take the name of their patron who had helped them. In this case, Claudius referring to the Emperor Claudius. And we're probably now in the year 58-ish, something like that. So this man's saying, with a large sum I obtained the citizenship. And it's unclear how we should read this. You know, he may be saying, he may be looking at Paul, who, remember, at this point is probably all beaten up and dirty, and Paul's claiming to be a Roman and a Jew, and he's claiming to be a Roman citizen, and the commander's thinking to himself, you know, I paid $1 million, or I paid $500,000 to become a citizen, and you're telling me you're a citizen? Like, you know, boy, the prices must have gone down a lot. You know, it's kind of he's incredulous. It could be read that way. And then Paul says, but I was born a citizen, which kind of is like he kind of trumps him in a way, because to be born a citizen was considered higher social class. Then immediately they were on verse 29. Then immediately those who were about to examine him withdrew from him. So the rest of the Roman soldiers who had been tying him up and ready to beat and interrogate him, they're standing by listening to this conversation when the commander comes in. And all of a sudden, when they hear, I was born a citizen, there's this like instinctive, they draw back. They don't want to have anything to do with this. And the commander was also afraid after he found out that he was a Roman, and because he had bound him. So he had, it was illegal what he had done. I mean, he was kind of quote unquote an innocent mistake. I mean, but he could be in big trouble. So this 30, the next day, because he wanted to know for certain why he, Paul, was accused by the Jews, he, Lysias Claudius, the commander, released him from his bonds and commanded the chief priests and all their council to appear, and brought Paul down and set him before them. So there was a lot of discussion about this in previous decades, I would say, because some of the commentators, modern kind of commentators, would say, oh, this is impossible. Luke's made this up. There's no way this could have happened. There's no way that the Roman commander could have ordered the Sanhedrin, which was the high priest, and then the 70 elders of Israel. There's no way he could have ordered them to meet. But actually, we have found evidence that did happen in history. We don't know about this particular case, but we know that, you know, so imagine the structure here. So you have this whole region of Judea, and the capital is in Caesarea on the coast where Paul had landed. And that's where, for example, Pontius Pilate, that was his headquarters. That was the governor's headquarters. Now, occasionally, especially during the feast days, he would, like we saw in the Gospels, the governor would come into Jerusalem and stay there for a while so that he could deal directly with situations as they arose. But in his absence, which was the majority of the time, the default commander, the default leader in this area in Jerusalem was the commander of the garrison, right? So he had all the Roman authority at this point. And if and they're the military leaders, he's got, we don't know for sure, but it's maybe something like 500 soldiers in the fortress there, and no one else is allowed to be armed. So if he told the Sanhedrin he wants them to meet, it's a pretty good bet they're going to meet, because otherwise, you know, it would probably be unpleasant consequences for them. So he calls them together, and it's not clear that, you know, it's not necessarily an official meeting of the Sanhedrin according to the Jewish rules, but in any case, he sent out word, I want as many of you to come as possible to help me discern what's going on here. Help me understand what this argument is about. What is your charge against him? All right, and so then he brings Paul down and set him before him. So brings him down. So we think that this council chambers for the Sanhedrin was on the west side of the temple precincts, so west or southwest side, maybe about a third of a mile from the fortress, which was on the northeast side of the temple precincts, right? All right, so now we're starting chapter 23. Paul is brought before the Sanhedrin. So remember, Jesus also was brought before the Sanhedrin. So we're seeing a lot of, and also this connection with the Roman authorities and going back and forth between questioning between the Roman authorities and the Sanhedrin. This is all, we saw all this exact play out with Jesus the same way. So part of the bigger picture here is that Paul is experiencing the same things Jesus experienced, just as Jesus predicted would happen to his disciples. So, Jesus predicted if I suffered, then you're going to suffer, because no disciple is greater than his master. So Jesus' prophecy is coming true with everything that's happened to Peter and John, how they were arrested and beaten earlier in Acts, how Stephen was killed. Now with Paul, all the true leaders and disciples of Jesus are going to experience the same thing Jesus experienced, and it just as he predicted. All right, so Paul is before the Sanhedrin.
Except John.
Except John.
Except for St. John.
Well, John is, remember, with John and Peter are the ones arrested earlier in Acts in chapters 3 and 5. So he was jailed and beaten. He's the only one who's not martyred. He's the one who's not killed. All right, 23. Then Paul, looking earnestly at the council, said, "Men and brethren, I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day." This is an interesting phrase, because kind of the Protestant construct of reading Paul is that Paul is this, is just constantly preaching, like according to John Calvin, the Calvinism, Presbyterians, that one of the most fundamental tenets of Calvinism is that we all human beings are totally, completely depraved, that we can do no good at all on our own, right? And this is supposed to be the hallmark of Paul's theology and therefore his law-free gospel. Here we have Paul saying, I've lived in all good conscience before God until this day. So those two don't match up. I mean, and then he says in Philippians also, he says, in his own handwriting in Philippians, he says that, as to the law, I was born a Pharisee, I was raised a Pharisee. As to the law, I was blameless, meaning innocent, didn't transgress the law at all. So again, this doesn't fit with this construct that we're constantly forced to see Paul through and see Christianity through. So he's saying, I've lived in all good conscience before God until this day. 2, and the high priest Ananias. Now here, let me just say something here. So this can get confusing, because just in the previous chapter, not the part we read today, but the part we read last time in the previous chapter, there's another Ananias that's mentioned. And this is Ananias the prophet, the Christian prophet, who we also learned about earlier when Paul has the conversion on the road to Damascus. Then he goes on to Damascus. There, it's Ananias who meets him and talks to him and restores his sight. This is Ananias, the Christian prophet who we saw in Damascus. Then he reappeared in the last chapter in the Christian community in Jerusalem. So he was this prophet figure, a Christian leader in the early church. This is a different Ananias. So now what we're talking about is the high priest Ananias. So, remember now, so if we're in the year 58, it's 25 years since Jesus's crucifixion and his trial. So at that time, we had this confusing case of Annas and Caiaphas, a father-in-law and son-in-law duo who were both kind of serving as high priest at that time. So they've passed from the scene now 25 years later. There's a new high priest, Ananias. And so he's the one who's the head of the Sanhedrin. So Paul says,
can I
yeah.
question? Isn't Ananias the Hebrew name for John? Because in the Arabic, Hannah and Hananias is the same name as John.
It could be. I don't know my etymology well enough. I mean, I know it's derived from Jonah. Jonah becomes John, but I don't know if.
Yeah, Yonan. It's
related.
Yeah, and I just wanted to, anyway, go ahead. I didn't mean to, I'm sorry, I interrupted, but I just thought it was another version of John.
It could be. Okay, so he's saying, I've lived in all good conscience before God until this day. In other words, he's saying, I haven't violated the law. You've dragged me here before you, but according to my conscience, I haven't violated the law. And so Ananias orders, someone, one of the his flunkies standing next to him, go beat some sense into him. So someone comes and gives him a smack across the face, just like in Jesus's trial. And it's not clear exactly why he does that. I mean, some people have said because he mentions the name of God, and all good conscience before God until this day, maybe they considered he was using the name of God in a possibly unacceptable way. Maybe maybe because he interrupted, he spoke out of turn. He wasn't asked to speak yet. He didn't know his place. Probably that's the most sensible, because we're going to see here that Paul is very bold in his speech. So anyway, he commands, the high priest says that Paul should be slapped. Now this is interesting, because this is another dichotomy that Luke is kind of highlighting for us. So you see with the Romans were not afraid of using violence by any means. They were ready to discourage him. But as soon as Paul says, I'm a Roman citizen, it's hands off. It would be illegal for them from that point even to slap him across the face. He could file charges against them, and the commander could be in very serious trouble. Now interesting. So on the one hand, when he says that to the Romans, who the Jews thought were these terrible people, the Romans respect their law and they follow their law. Now he's in front of the Jews, who are ironically accusing Paul of breaking the Jewish law. And Paul says, I'm a Jew. I'm blameless before the law. I'm innocent. It's, according to the Jewish law as well, the burden is on you to prove that I'm guilty. I'm innocent. And so Ananias slaps him. And after Paul has said, I'm a Jew and that I'm following the law. So what Ananias has done is broken the law. Ananias has broken the Jewish law. He cannot do that. The Romans, ironically, follow their own law. And here the high priest violates the law. So then verse 3, so Ananias has someone strike him. And then Paul says, listen to this boldness. 3, then Paul said to him, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. For you sit to judge me according to the law, and do you command me to be struck contrary to the law? So you have the audacity to sit in judgment of me for supposedly breaking the Jewish law, and the first thing you do is break the law. Because the law clearly says you cannot strike someone on unfounded charges. The charges have to be proven first. And so, this passage has generated a lot of commentary in recent times among modern commentators for saying like, oh, look at Paul, how angry Paul gets. That's inappropriate. Paul threatens or curses him. He curses him, really. He says, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. Whitewashed wall means, like in Greece, they still to this day, they use whitewash a lot. It's like a thin white paint that normally you apply every year to your house or to your walls to freshen it up. And that's why we have all these beautiful photos of Greece of the white houses with the blue, because traditionally everyone whitewashes every year to give a fresh light coat that's cheap. But he's saying when they use this insult, whitewashed wall, they mean the wall itself could be crumbling. The wall itself could be in total disrepair, about to fall down. But if you whitewash it for a short period of time, it looks good on the outside. So it's the same. Paul's telling him, you're pretending to be pious on the outside, but you're actually violating the law, and I haven't. And when he says God will strike you, it's interesting that the fathers comment on this, because in Deuteronomy, it says that God will strike those who violate his law. And so actually in the oral tradition, it became an acceptable, even to this day, the rabbis say it's an acceptable curse for someone to invoke on someone else, because you're merely reciting the law. God says, I will strike those who disobey my commandments. And so Paul's simply stating a fact from scripture, and you could see it, as prophesying. So the fathers see him now as not as cursing out of anger, but simply prophesying. You just broke the law, which is a fact. You cannot strike a Jew without proving the case first. And so he's saying God will strike you, and this was a kind of an acceptable curse, but it's not out of anger, it's a prophecy. And it turns out to be true. We know historically from Josephus that this high priest was extremely corrupt, and he ends up short time after this, well, actually, it's probably in the year 66, so about 8 years after this, ends up, and he was very pro-Roman, so he ends up being killed by Jewish zealots as he's hiding in a tunnel in Jerusalem. So Paul said, and Bede, actually, the Venerable Bede, this English commentator, says he looks into the Greek grammar, and he says that it's a declarative statement. God will strike you. It's not optative, meaning the optative mood is when we say, may God strike you. He doesn't say, may God strike you. He says, God will strike you. He's simply quoting the law. God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. Now, he does add a little bit of sauce to this by saying, you whitewashed wall. And St. John Chrysostom is quick to point out, it's not that Paul's angry, it's that he's bold. He's speaking with boldness because he has Christ on his side. Will you sit to judge me according to the law? And do you command me to be struck contrary to the law? Verse 4. And those who stood by said, do you revile God's high priest? So again, there's this parallel with what happened with Jesus. And it's true that Paul spoke very boldly. And people are saying, you can't speak to the high priest like that. Who do you think you are? Do you revile God's high priest? Then Paul, verse 5, then Paul said, I did not know, brothers, that he was the high priest. For it is written, and he's quoting the law, Moses' law, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. That's from Exodus. You shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. So here, there's this interesting kind of play going on here. And a lot of commentary has been on this phrase too. Did Paul really not know that he was the high priest? Or is it kind of ironic by saying, well, he certainly doesn't act like a high priest, so I didn't know he was one. Some people say that that's what it means, but more likely, because this is an irregular meeting, it may be that the high priest isn't sitting in his usual place. It may be that the Roman commander is kind of presiding over the meeting on this unusual meeting that Paul really didn't know. And the high priest wouldn't have been wearing his vestments from the temple. So the most likely is that it's true. And Paul kind of apologizes. He said, I didn't know. But then he quotes the law. So in other words, he's trying to say, I'm the one who's being faithful to the law. Even when I mess up, I recognize right away, oh, I messed up. It was out of ignorance. I didn't know. The law says you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. 6. So now Paul changes tack. But when Paul perceived that one part, meaning of the Sanhedrin that were gathered there, that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. Concerning the hope and resurrection of the dead, I am being judged. All right, so now all chaos is going to break loose because he sees this. And this is one of those classic scenes of Paul's brilliance, and how he uses his knowledge to, and in the Jewish tradition, even, around this time in the following centuries, but even before that, the Jewish tradition always, to us it seems strange, but the Jewish tradition always valued and respected these clever tricks and ploys. So, like Jacob tricks Esau out of his birthright, right? And there's this kind of admiration for Jacob's cleverness, right? There's all kinds of examples of this, especially in the rabbinic interpretation. So this is so Paul's in this line. He's clever. He uses his mind. So now, what do they mean by the Sadducees and the Pharisees? All right, so these were two of the big groups, schools of Jews at this time. The others are Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the Essenes are considered probably the three biggest schools. Now, not everyone would have identified necessarily with one of these schools, but especially among the people who were particularly religious, they would have tended to fall into one of these schools. All right, so the Sadducees, the name actually is derived from Zadok. Now, who is Zadok? Zadok was priestly line. So he was from the tribe of the Levites, and he was a direct descendant of Aaron, the first high priest, through Eleazar, Aaron's son. And he was a priest during the time of David. So I don't know, 400 or 500 years, let's say, after Moses and Aaron. So, they kept track of this hereditary priesthood. And the high priesthood traditionally had to come from Aaron himself. And the priesthood in general in the Levites came from the whole tribe of the Levites. So over these, let's say, 400 years until the time of David, it was Zadok who crowned David. And so this was always taken up as, especially in the later tradition after that, as this, it was Zadok who followed God and anointed the shepherd boy as the king instead of Saul, who went out on a limb, followed God's will. And so it was considered that the true high priesthood would always come through the line of Zadok. So it would go from Aaron, Eleazar, his son, and then only those who were descended. So by that time, you have 400 years, you have many branches, but only those who came from the line of Zadok would be entitled to the high priesthood. And this became the Jewish tradition. It's reflected in Ezekiel. So by this time, you have the Sadducees have given this name to themselves, meaning the Zadokites, and they tend to be this priestly class. They have the high priesthood. But now here's the irony. The irony is that none of them probably are actually from the line of Zadok. They've appropriated this name in order to legitimize themselves. So actually what was happening at this time, really Judaism was a mess at this time. And that's why you have you have the Essenes going out to Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls, separating themselves. You have a lot of chaos because, you have these Roman overlords. Nothing was as it should be at this point. There was the king was not even a Jew. He was Herod was a Nabatean and his descendants. He was only technically of the Jewish religion. So he wasn't the real king. And the high priesthood had been appointed by the king since the time of the Maccabees. So the Maccabees are about the year 200 BC. They're the ones who throw off the Greek domination after, the descendants of Alexander the Great, who had defiled the temple. And the Maccabees are these Jewish revolutionaries, kind of set the stage for future zealots, nationalists. The Maccabees throw off the Greeks. They reclaim some level of independence. They establish a celebration of Hanukkah in 200 BC as when they rededicate the temple and cleanse it from the defilement that the Gentiles had done inside their temple by sacrificing a pig on the altar. Hanukkah is established at this time, 200 BC. So all of this story of the Maccabees, it only takes place in 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Maccabees, most of which, like the Protestants, do not accept as part of Scripture. But it's a very important historical time period. So the Maccabees,
it is in the Apocrypha, correct?
It's in the
Apocrypha, right?
so-called Apocrypha, which the church never.
Is this where the term the desolation, abomination of desolation, when it came, when Antiochus came into Jerusalem and did that, sacrificing the pig?
Epiphanes, he sacrificed this pig on the altar in the temple. This was called the abomination of desolation. That's a term that appears in Daniel, and so that's part of the reason that Daniel in the form all of us have inherited it includes elements. Parts of it were written maybe 700 BC, but parts of it were written around this time, around 200 BC. And so that phrase comes in as describing what Antiochus did in 200 BC. That's where the phrase comes from. So these later parts of Daniel and the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th Maccabees are the ones that carry all this stuff. So anyway, what happens with the Maccabees is they take over, they reestablish Jewish control, but the Maccabees, these revolutionaries, they don't supposedly they were fighting for, we want to follow the law, we're Jewish nationalists. So you would think that they would try to reestablish someone who had a rightful claim to the Davidic throne, and that they would try to reestablish someone as the high priest who had a rightful claim through the line of Zadok. What do? Like most revolutionaries, they give it to their family and friends. So the Maccabees appoint one of their own brothers as the high priest, who is not even from the tribe of Levi. So totally irregular, not, totally irregular. And that situation continues from like 150, 200 BC until this time. Now, in that time, this group develops called the Sadducees, who are of this priestly group, who are political appointees, basically. So now the high priests that are appointed by the Roman authorities, basically, and they just pick people who are going to be loyal to them, who have no priestly lineage at all. But this group takes this name, the Zadokites, to try to, it's like a PR move to try to show that they are really interested in the purity of the priesthood and so on. But that's why in the Dead Sea Scrolls, their main complaint in the Dead Sea Scrolls is about the high priesthood, the priesthood in Jerusalem, because they're illegitimate. That's why they've withdrawn from Jerusalem into the desert. So anyway, that's what's, so these Sadducees are a school of Judaism at this time that tend to be of the priesthood. And really, there's an estimate that there may have been 2,000 priests living just in Jerusalem at the time, but there were many classes of priests, because anyone from the line of the priesthood could, from tracing their descent to Aaron, not Eleazar and Zadok, but to Aaron, was a priest. Now, only those from the line of Zadok could be claimed to be the high priest normally. So anyway, you have lots of priests in Jerusalem, but they didn't always align. It was the upper class ones, the political appointees, who had their kind of own group, and they controlled all the power. It's estimated that the high priest actually controlled, at this time, this high priest probably controlled 70% of all privately held land in
Wow.
because they had just used this to amass power and money. They weren't legitimate. They weren't legitimate priests, let alone the high priest. And so they ended up, these high priests, they acquired 70% of the land, which was guaranteed according to the Torah, according to the law, that this was to be forever in the possession of the people whom God had allotted it to. Instead, they break the law, they seize control of it, and then they rent it back to the people who rightfully have it, who rightfully own it, as slave laborers on their own land. Again, breaking the law. All right, so that's the Sadducees. Sadducees is this, you could call it theological, also political group. And they're defined by, supposedly, they say they believe only in the Torah. They only believe in the first 5 books, or that at least that's their main emphasis. So they don't accept any kind of oral tradition. So in a way, you could see some similarity with the sola scriptura movement in the last few centuries here in the West, where we only accept the Bible. We don't accept any man-made traditions, right? So the Sadducees are claiming the same thing, that we only accept the first 5 books. All right. And the other, Pharisees. Now, Pharisees would be the kind of opposite extreme. They would tend, not entirely, but they tend not to be of the Levites. And these are people who are interested in studying the law. So, Paul identifies himself as a Pharisee. So, typically for Pharisees, they would study at the feet of rabbis. So the whole kind of institution of rabbis is directly connected with the Pharisees. Rabbis and Pharisees go hand in hand. So there's a different kind of leadership structure for the rabbis, for the Pharisees. For them, it's the scholars of the law who are the true leaders, not the priests. So you can see there's a certain conflict built in here. Now, the Sadducees were probably the majority of the Sanhedrin of the 70, but over the years, more and more Pharisees had gotten in, because it seems probably the people identified more with the Pharisees than the Sadducees, who were stealing all their land. So there's this natural tension between the two. And we're going to see here, Luke's going to explain to us what the theological tension is between them. But there's also this kind of political tension, because for one, the center of power is the temple and the priests, the priesthood. The other, the center of power is the synagogues and the rabbis, the teachers of the study of the law, not the sacrifices. So Paul sees this and he says, I'm a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. And it's concerning the hope and resurrection of the dead, meaning the hope of the resurrection of the dead, that I'm being judged, that all of this is a farce. It's these Sadducees who are trumping up these charges against me just because I'm a Pharisee and I believe in the resurrection. Now, Luke is going to tell us why here in verse 7. And when Paul had said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For Sadducees, here's the explanation. For Sadducees say that there is no resurrection and no angel or spirit. No, it's unclear what St. Luke means by this no angel or spirit, but basically the Sadducees' position was, and if you look at the Old Testament, if you read the Old Testament all the way up until, basically, well, at least until, let's say, 500, after the return from exile in Babylon, there's no mention of the resurrection in the Old Testament. There's no real evidence that Jews before the year 500 BC or so thought anything about an afterlife as such. That, you may have had this idea of Sheol, which was kind of like this nebulous, not clearly defined place where the dead were kind of held in a sort of prison. There's some idea about that, but there's no idea about the resurrection at the end times, nothing like this. And so the Sadducees do not believe in the resurrection. They say, hey, we only believe the five books of the Torah. We don't know anything about this nonsense about resurrection. You only start getting that in the Old Testament when you get to the same period I was talking about before, the latest parts of Daniel and 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Maccabees, which the Protestants, for some bizarre reason, reject. That's when all the evidence really starts coming in about the resurrection. So he's saying the Sadducees say there is no resurrection. There's no such thing, and no angel or spirit. Now, the angel or spirit, he's probably referring to the big kind of discord between the Sadducees and the Pharisees was that the Pharisees had this idea of the oral tradition, the oral law that went alongside the written tradition. and they would often ascribe this to the work of angels and the spirit. These were inspired kind of commentaries on the scriptures, and that they would even say that the scriptures themselves were mediated from God to Moses by angels. Paul says this one time, even though it doesn't appear in the Old Testament at all. This was a common Pharisee belief in Paul's time. So probably that's what he's saying.
It seems like it's a repetition is what we're seeing here between those two entities, that some believed in the tradition and some only believed in the written word of the law. And here we are with the Protestants believing in sola scriptura and casting out and away and negating all the traditions of it seems like is a repetition in history of what is happening today versus what happened between those two peoples in the Old Testament.
Yeah, you could.
Does that sound?
I think that's a legitimate parallelism, but I've said before too that even the 5 books of the Torah, that we could easily call that man-made tradition, because it exists only as an oral tradition for several centuries before it's finally written down by human beings, and all of this is mediated by human beings like Moses, etc. So it's a really kind of arbitrary and capricious distinction between the written and the oral. I mean, there's no kind of evidence that, we're not Muslims where we believe that the Quran is the direct word of God and that Moses went into a trance and just copied like Muhammad supposedly did. So anyway, all right. Yeah. So that's the distinction. And here you see in Luke in particular, in St. Luke's Gospel and in Acts, St. Luke there's a lot has been written about this, about St. Luke's attitude toward the Pharisees. It's very subtle. Because a lot of times, as maybe casual readers of the Bible, we of course have a very negative attitude about the Pharisees, especially from Matthew's Gospel. those criticisms, Jesus's criticisms of the Pharisees are repeated also in Luke's gospel. But for Luke, he introduces a little subtlety. For Luke sees some good in the Pharisees, and we're going to understand this a little bit more, because the Pharisees are open to the idea of the resurrection, which the others weren't, right? And so Luke sees some potential. We know that many Pharisees did end up becoming Christians. The problem is, maybe the animosity comes up is that they're so close and yet they're so far. They're so close to it. They acknowledge that there is this hope of the resurrection, this hope of the Messiah and the resurrection, but they refuse to believe that Jesus is that person and that he was resurrected. They're still waiting. So there's almost this love-hate relationship that they're so close. Out of all the Jews, maybe they're the closest to believing, and yet that they're right there and they refuse to see what's right before their eyes. All right. So, okay. And verse 8, but the Pharisees confess both, meaning the resurrection and the activity of these angels or spirits. 9. Just to say another word about the Sadducees. So the Sadducees represent more of the old ancient Judaism. And many people have said you still see this attitude among some perhaps Orthodox Jews, that there are some Orthodox Jews who make a claim that they are Jewish, they follow the law, but they don't believe in God. They don't believe in God. So in other words, something almost like that could be said of the Sadducees, that they don't believe that, they believe that this law has come down to them from some divine source, but that ultimately there's nothing active happening now, and that there's nothing's going to happen in the future. It's really, this is our tradition, and this is the law we live by. That could be true for some of them. Now I think that's interesting too, in light of, I was reading this book last week about secularism, and really that's kind of the hallmarks of secularism, is that even among so-called believers, Christians, we've become secularists in that we deny any active role for God. Basically, many of us have adopted the framework of secularism, which is that God existed at the beginning, and that God is this kind of clockmaker, he's often called, or the intelligent designer. He sets things in order. He starts the clock ticking. He sets the ball rolling, the plan unfolding, and then he's out of the picture. And then he may or may not appear in people's belief again at the end of time, when he's going to judge how well we did according to the clock or the plan he started unfolding at the beginning of time. But in between, he's like nowhere to be found. He's not actively involved in our lives. And this is basically civil Christianity today. I mean, if you look at, Church of the Highlands, God bless them, but I mean, that's basically what they believe. I mean, you don't hear them talking about miracles and God working actively in their life. You hear them talking about, what's God's will for me? I have to discern, does God want me to be a car salesman or a banker? I have to discern this, because God set this ball rolling, this plan unfolding at the beginning of time. All these things are predetermined, which is what Calvin would say, and that I'm going to be judged at the end of time on how well I discerned what this plan God had from the beginning of time was. I mean, and that has zero to do with ancient Christianity. Zero. I mean, it's complete secularism with a thin veneer of Christianity on top of it. We've reduced God to, and this God in our civil religion here in America can be anybody. It doesn't have to be Jesus Christ. It's this Judeo-Christian values God who is just this God, not Jesus, not the Holy Spirit, not the three persons of the Trinity. God, this intelligent designer who judges us on our ability to discern his secret will that he's unfolded from the beginning of time. And Orthodoxy would say to that, baloney. That is not Christianity. That is far from Christianity. It would be better if you were an atheist than to believe that nonsense. I mean, that has reduced God to this. And then you have Christians, fundamentalist evangelicals, arguing for this baloney, saying, oh no, intelligent design. And they get all into this debate with the evolution people. No, God was this intelligent designer, blah, blah, blah. we don't want to reduce God to this intelligent designer who started the clock ticking at the beginning of time and then disappears until the end of time. No, God is actively present. There's a transcendent world with us right now. God is actively present and has his hand guiding history with our own free will involved in it, not some predetermined, we're all predetermined whether we're going to be saved or all this nonsense. No. That is, it's a
Brother, they are very afraid to talk about any miracles or any. My experience is that even if they do say something, they want to say it in secret. They're afraid to tell you that the Lord spoke to me in a certain way. But in our experiences, God is every day showing us signs and wonders. You know, I see it every day. Thank God, by the grace of God. I mean, even when I'm cooking, I feel like God is talking to me, you know, about different things. And the Lord is so, available in our lives, not just available, but prominent. And we're so aware of his presence. But they don't talk about these things. They never talk about a miracle. They might praise God if some prayer is answered.
Because they would consider it, because the secular society has framed the issue the following way. They frame the issue of, faith is fine. This kind of, when you're a child, it's good to take your kid to church and raise them up. It's kind of like, it's good to let them believe in the tooth fairy and Santa Claus and Halloween. And that's appropriate for when you're a kid. But when you grow up, you mature from this fairy tale faith into science. And so they've established science equals maturity. Science equals education, right? Faith is nice and appropriate when you're a kid, but it's fairy tale. So what happens is these modern Christians from the Highlands are conflicted because society is telling them, if you talk about miracles and stuff like this, people are going to laugh at you. I mean, it's okay if you want to go to church, take your kids to church when they're kids. It's okay to play along with Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy with them. But, adults don't believe this stuff, right? I mean, you could say that, okay, the best you can do is say that God had an intelligent design and he's going to judge us at the end. All right. Okay. That's about as far as you can go without being mocked, right? And so that's what they end up believing. And then Christianity just becomes a self-help cult, we might be able to, how can we study the word so that we can discern this predetermined will of God, whether I should be a banker or a car salesman or whatever. Somehow, by studying the Bible, I'm going to be able to discern this will of God, right? It says it has nothing to do with Christianity. I'm sorry. It's heresy. It is heresy. It would be better, in my opinion, just go ahead and be an atheist, please. I mean, that's why it drives me crazy. Like, oh, well, Father, we're going to Church of the Highlands now. And I'm supposed to be happy about this? I'm not happy about this. I mean, that's complete secularism. I mean, just be atheist already. I mean, just be honest. Anyway, I digress. All right. So this is the difference between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. So verse 9, let's just finish this up. Then there arose a loud outcry, and the scribes of the Pharisees' party. So who are these scribes? We hear about them in the gospel as well, and they're usually identified with scribes, lawyers, Pharisees. All right, the scribes are ones who are copyists. And so typically someone like Paul, who said he was raised as a Pharisee, had rabbinic training. The rabbinic training, which is Pharisee, is the Pharisees. You would usually start out as a young boy and you would spend years where the only thing you would do is copy the law, right? You would produce copies of the law, which were needed. And you would spend years where the teacher would stand at the front of the room. It was called what the Latins called a scriptorum. The teacher would stand at the front of the room and read from a single copy. And the students who were in rows, maybe 20, 30, would copy what they heard. And then the teacher would check their work. And so basically they were memorizing and copying the law, the first five books constantly for years, right? These are the scribes. Mm-hmm. These are the kind of the apprentice rabbis. All right. And the scribes of the Pharisees' party arose and protested, saying, "We find no evil in this man, but if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him, let us not fight against God." So in other words, now that the issue becomes on party grounds, which was what Paul kind of intended. He throws it into this party dispute. And the Pharisees, they don't even know what the issue is yet, but they're just because Paul has identified himself as a Pharisee. Now the Pharisees are a minority in the Sanhedrin. They're used to getting trampled by the Sadducees. And so here they find a chance to say, no, we're not going along with this. We're defending the Pharisee. They don't even know what the issue is. Except Paul tells them it has something to do with the spirits. And they say, we allow that the spirit has spoken to this man. It could be that the spirit spoke to this man. The Sadducees always say, no, that doesn't happen, but it could be. Now, here's the irony. So the Pharisees are admitting that there's a possibility for the resurrection, a bodily resurrection. They're admitting that the spirit or an angel can speak to people and give them revelation, and which are the two things that Paul is claiming. He's saying, Jesus was the one resurrected from the dead, and that he spoke directly to me and gave me this commandment. So they're admitting the possibility that everything Paul says is true, but they also wouldn't go so far as to say that it is true. They're saying it's possible, but we would say that he's making it up. But you have this irony going on. Verse 10, now when there arose a great dissension, the commander, fearing lest Paul might be pulled to pieces by them, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him by force from among them and bring him into the barracks. So in other words, the same thing that happened the day before. This kind of riot is breaking out between the Sadducees and the Pharisees, that Paul kind of instigated. The commander, again, probably doesn't understand anything they're saying. They're speaking in Aramaic, assuredly, but he sees that, here we go again. So he said, he tells his guys, get him out of there, put him in protective custody again, and take him back to the barracks where we can keep him safe. All right, and then that sets the stage. So then that's going to force the Romans' hand what to do next. So we'll take that up next time. So we'll end here on 23:10 and pick up at 23:11.